The traders in the market say to the Fed, yeah, you say you're going to get interest rates down around 3 or 4% from where they're at now or even lower, and we don't believe you. We have had record low unemployment numbers for the last year plus. That can't continue forever. At some point, the economy will weaken for one reason or another, and we can talk about the reasons why. But when that comes, the Fed will have to lower interest rates.
This is Maestro Minute, the show that discusses all things real estate, sharing interviews with the most successful people in the industry. Hear from their perspective and what they are doing to achieve success. Get exclusive tips on how you can also succeed in real estate. Maestro Minute is brought to you by Maestro Development. Here's your host, Nareg Muradian.
Where is the economy currently in the U.S. and how do you see it kind of on a high level where we're heading? What's the climate of the economy in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because the economy is strong if you look at all the fundamentals. And we've got inflation coming down. It's pretty close to what the Fed's target is. We're expecting that on Friday, the PCE, which is the main measure that the Fed uses to measure inflation, will probably be around 2.5%. That's pretty darn good. The economy continues to grow even with high interest rates. We've had good jobs numbers.
Inflation is targeted at 2.6%?
Inflation's targeted around 2 to 3%.
Currently. So it's gone back down.
So it's gone down, and it's down around 2.5% now. And it depends on what measure you use, and we can come back to that.
Yeah.
But the measure that the Fed uses, we expect will be about 2.6. That's kind of what experts are expecting. That's come down a lot in the last couple of years. Gas prices have come down a little bit in the last few months. Jobs, like I said, the jobs reports have been good. The economy is growing really well, and yet there's a lot of discontent. So one of the things that a lot of economists are trying to figure out is why so many consumers seem to be unhappy with the state of the economy when, by all these measures, low unemployment and everything else, it's doing better than it was doing a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. So it's in an interesting place. I would say that quantitatively, the things we can measure look good, but people obviously wish that it could be doing better. And I think if we're looking forward, there's a lot of risks that could bring that down. Economies don't keep growing this beautifully forever.
Right.
So there's a lot of problems that could emerge over the next couple of years.
Okay, great. No, that's great. Exciting to hear that. So that kind of gets us into our first question about Fed policy.
Yeah.
So next couple of years, how do you see Fed policy affecting the economy coming up in the end of the year? Obviously, it's an election year, and then next year or so.
Yeah.
You brought your crystal ball with you.
Right, of course. Everything I say will come true. No, not at all. So we do our best. I always say that, the famous story, Irving Fisher, one of the famous economists from the early 20th century, he used to go to dinner parties and people would say to him, what's going to happen to the stock market over the next year? And he always said, it will definitely fluctuate.
Yeah.
That's about all we know for sure. But hopefully our educated guesses are better than nothing. And the way I like to think about it is, if I can give you information that's useful, even if I can't predict everything, you can take that information and plug it into your business model. Helps you make a little more sense out of what to do with your business going forward. So from a monetary policy standpoint, like I said, inflation about 2.5%. Now, one question we can ask is whether we actually trust that number. I think that the government does a good job of measuring inflation. I don't want to cast doubt on their measure per se, but it is a backward-looking measure. It tells us how inflation has been doing.
So there's
over
a
the last
lag,
month.
right?
Right.
Yeah. Right.
And so what you really care about.
What's the lag? Is it 2 months or?
So I mean, they can get up to a month ago. They can tell us how inflation has been doing, but they can't tell us what's going to happen over the next 6 months or the next year. So what you really care about if you're trying to set monetary policy is what's going to happen in the future. Because if I change interest rates today, that's going to affect economic activity months from now, right? It doesn't affect anything that happened in the past. So I like to look always at a measure that some folks at Penn State have put together. There's a couple of professors over there. There's also a professor in our backyard here who's a part of that team, Ed Colson at UC Irvine, who's a good friend of mine. And they have put together a measure of inflation that's a little more forward-looking. And the way they do it is using real estate. You and I have talked a little bit about this measure before. You've seen me show these graphs. I like comparing theirs to the official government measure because what they do is they take the housing component of inflation, which is a huge chunk. It's about 40% of inflation is housing costs. And they say the problem with the way that the government is measuring inflation in the housing market is they're asking people across the economy, how much are you paying? But that doesn't tell you how much it's going to change. To do that, what you want to look at is new leases, people who are getting new apartments. How is the rent changing when they get a new contract? Because you might be paying a lower rate or a higher rate because you got locked into an apartment 6 months ago. Well, what I want to know is the people who are signing the contracts today. So they change to that measure of new leases, so they get a better forward-looking measure of rent. And their estimate of where inflation is closer to 2.2%. So I think based on that evidence, it's fair to say that the economy has cooled down enough that the Fed doesn't have to worry about inflation like it did a year ago. I think the Fed knows that for the most part, but they've been reluctant to reduce rates yet. They've just been keeping them steady. The last measure that came in inflation was the CPI numbers a couple of weeks ago. And it was right before their last decision. And they made the decision to keep rates the same. The CPI came in better than what they were expecting, but I think they want to be more cautious and they'd already made up their minds, and so they weren't going to cut rates. I think if we continue to see good news, where inflation keeps coming down over the next month or so, then the next big decision they make will be September. I anticipate they'll cut rates in September. We could also see another cut later this year. So I think it's reasonable to expect a couple of rate cuts by the end of the year.
What's triggered the inflation numbers to go down? Like, what's the root of that? Is that just increased? Like, obviously it's very complicated, but is that increase of supply, to meet the demand, and however that works? Or what have you seen help, from a economic standpoint for that?
Yeah. I think it's a combination of an increase in supply and a decrease in demand, the two major things that would drive prices down. There's been a big argument throughout the pandemic, what was really driving inflation? Was it supply or demand? It was definitely a combination of the two, because on the one hand, you had a major supply chain crisis. That makes lots of things more scarce, and scarcity drives up prices, right? People have to compete for scarce goods. They try to outbid each other. That's just the way that capitalism works. So that supply chain crisis has abated over the years, and we're starting to see that prices are moderating as a result. The other thing that happened in the pandemic was there was a lot of government stimulus money that came through. Now, part of that was for a good reason. It was so that we didn't repeat the mistakes of 2008 and 9 when we didn't have enough stimulus and we wound up in a really long, extended recession and a very slow recovery. So this time they went all out and we had a surge in demand. Most of that money has been, if not spent, at least allocated. And when you look at the GDP numbers, the gross domestic product numbers, they show you how much of the changes in GDP is due to government spending. And during the early years of the pandemic, it was a big boost. And now it's actually a drag on GDP. So it's pulled demand back. So it's a combination of an increase in supply and a pullback in demand.
My wife last night, I told her we were meeting, and she wanted to ask you about, I hope she doesn't mind, but discretionary income or discretionary spending.
Yeah.
How is that tracking? Obviously in a capitalistic market, you have the Amazons and everything is like instant gratification. That spending is still occurring. I think it's slowed down in retail, but I guess how is discretionary confidence right now in the U.S.?
Well, this is another one of those areas where the numbers are good, but the sentiment is not as good. So it's interesting. Consumption growth is pretty strong. People are continuing to spend like they have. Now, some of that is because income growth has grown pretty well, and some of it is because debt has grown pretty well. So credit card bills have piled up too.
Right.
I don't think they're anywhere near a level that we should be concerned about a financial crisis or anything. Historically, they're not at super high levels, but as credit card debt continues to pile up, at a certain point, you do worry that consumers will, over leverage themselves. So that has enabled people to continue growing their consumption. At the same time, those consumers don't seem to be reporting that they're as confident in the economy as you would normally expect for times like this when consumption is growing.
Well, and I keep hearing there's two economies, right? There's the Wall Street and the Main Street, and there's that disconnect, right?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a problem that a lot of people are having to address. How do you address those different entities?
Yeah.
And then back to inflation. Inflation is tied to, well, the interest rates are tied to inflation. So now that you see the rates coming back down, like what is your forecast on the rates? from the Fed?
Yeah. Like I said, I think we'll have a couple of rate cuts later this year. I also think that there are a number of risks out there in the global economy that can slow down the economy. It's not going to, we have had record low unemployment numbers for the last year plus. That can't continue forever. At some point, the economy will weaken for one reason or another, and we can talk about the reasons why. But when that comes, the Fed will have to lower interest rates. Now, the interesting thing is the bond markets actually seem to think that interest rates are going to stay high for a while. They are predicting that the long-term interest rates over the next 5 to 10 years, medium-term to long-term, are actually going to be higher than what the Fed is saying they're going to be. So they don't believe the Fed. The traders in the market say to the Fed, yeah, you say you're going to get interest rates down around 3 or 4% from where they're at now or even lower, and we don't believe you. So there's plenty of people out there who don't think the Fed is going to lower rates. I don't think rates will stay as high as they are right now.
Thanks for tuning in to the Maestro Minute Podcast. Make sure to rate this podcast if you found it helpful, share it with a friend that could use it, and follow us on all major podcast platforms. The Maestro Minute, powered by Maestro Development.